With a plot centered around isolation and wrecked life plans, the 2000 film Castaway may have become at least slightly more relatable over the past year. And while these concepts can easily come across as bleak, I think the film managed to approach them in a way that's hopeful and reassuring. I actually consider Castaway one of my comfort movies, one I rewatch occasionally when I want to feel a little more at peace with the unpredictability of life, and reflect on the simple joys I often take for granted. The ending is widely regarded as bittersweet, if not downright heartbreaking. But I personally feel it was the best choice for Chuck's story, and made the spiritual core of the film more impactful and enduring. So in this video, I want to revisit Castaway and examine the overarching elements in its narrative, and how I feel these elements ultimately result in a happy, hopeful ending. Hey guys, it's Steph, just popping in real quick to let y'all know our Patreon is going to be launching on July 1st. It'll have extra content like more video essays, podcasts, and you can even help us pick out our next video topics. So keep an eye out for that, and now back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Hello, Kelly, are you there? Pick up. You're not there.
Castaway stars Tom Hanks and Helen Hunt, but mostly Tom Hanks, in a story that's largely summed up by the movie title. Chuck Noland, a FedEx executive, has a busy career-driven life and a girlfriend he plans to marry, until a plane crash strands him on an uninhabited island for over 4 years. In that time span, he learns not just about physical survival, but emotional and spiritual survival. When he makes the choice to leave the island, he's rescued at last, returns home, and must come to terms with the new life he's been granted. And that's about it. There's no villain or grand rescue, no dramatic character arc where Chuck transforms from a selfish douche into a man who's mystically wise and has it all figured out. It's just a story about a normal guy with some somewhat skewed priorities, whose life got knocked off course.
Anybody!
A story that seemingly ends with the all-too-familiar sentiment, well, what do I do now? The plot itself is refreshingly concise, and it started off as an even simpler idea. One day in the mid-90s, Tom Hanks read an article about FedEx and wondered what would happen if one of their freight planes crashed into the ocean. That's how the idea for the Castaway survival film first originated, but Hanks didn't want to make the same formulaic story people had always seen. In an interview with The Guardian, he said there's a standard way of telling this story, and that's to have a rich, snotty guy who's obviously not in touch with what's important and blah blah blah, and then he learns a lesson and he's not like that anymore. But Chuck learns no great lessons. He's just this guy who has this job, fate deals him this hand, and suddenly he's standing there saying, my God, over and above good and bad, isn't life strange? Bill Broyles, the film screenwriter, could empathize with this notion on a pronounced level. He was drafted for the Vietnam War in the 60s. In his book Brothers in Arms, he wrote about how he felt during his time there. What has brought me, out of all the rich possibilities of life, here, now, to this? Is this why my mother bore me? Why my parents raised me? Is all my youth, is it all come to this sorry end, to die so far away in a piece of mud? It sounded so familiar to Chuck's story, so much like all stories with untimely ends. Considering this, the experience likely gave Broyles a special insight into how daunting and demoralizing a castaway's ordeal could be. He also drew inspiration from Robinson Crusoe, a 1719 novel by Daniel Defoe detailing a castaway's decades-long adventures, inspired by the true story of the castaway Alexander Selkirk, which was written about in A Voyage to the South Sea and Round the World by Edward Cook. Still, Broyles wanted a more intimate understanding of what this experience might be like, so he spent about a week on an uninhabited island, figuring out how to prepare food and shelter on his own.
They took me down to the Sea of Cortez, and they stuck me on the beach. I had to make a shelter, and then I had to figure out how to, very quickly you realize, oh my God, I've got to survive. Where do I get water? How do I do anything?
A lot of the survivalist elements in Castaway are drawn from his experiences alone on the island. He ate raw stingrays, drank juice from dozens of coconuts, spent a day and a half making a fire.
Yes! Look what I have created! I have made fire!
He even found a volleyball on the beach and named it Wilson, an idea which later morphed into perhaps the most memorable character of the film.
And I had no one to talk to. And I got up this third morning and this volleyball had washed up on the beach. And I went down and looked at it, I thought, Wilson. And started playing with this volleyball and talking to it. I guess that's so clearly something part of being human, that you want to relate to something, and I found myself talking to this volleyball.
You would have imagined by any chance, would you?
Ironically, the hit show Survivor debuted just a few months before Castaway's release, and the film's team soon grew tired of people comparing a reality show to the film they'd poured their heart into for 6 years. Hanks told the LA Times, "I didn't want to show a man conquering his environment, but rather the effect the environment has on him." One such example of this labor of love was Broyles, Hanks, and director Robert Zemeckis' bold decision to completely refrain from using music and voiceovers during Chuck's time on the island. There'd also be no cuts to show what was going on back home. So while watching the movie, it's as though we're stranded there with Chuck, fully immersed in his quiet and lonely experience. We watched as he learned to make effective tools, as he created a friend, as he knocked a tooth out with the blade of an ice skate, a moment which still makes me physically cringe just thinking about. All we could do was watch as he talked to himself and went through the motions of day-to-day survival.
Coconut milk's a natural laxative. Things Gilligan never told us.
The scenes are uncomplicated and stripped of pretense. Even the title is uncomplicated, but on further inspection appears to have a double meaning. The term castaway is one word, but the movie's title splits it into two, transforming it into a verb that exemplifies Chuck's philosophy by the end of the film: to cast away regrets, expectations, and the illusion of control. On that note, how does a movie where so little happens manage to convey so much? I think it involves 3 existential things the film drives us to reflect upon. Right off the bat, we're shown that Chuck Noland is a man obsessed with time, or more distinctly, the productivity we could accomplish with it.
Because we live or we die by the clock. We never ever allow ourselves the sin of losing track of time.
He's introduced to us as he lectures his subordinates on the value of time, how every second counts, and it's made clear he cares about work maybe a little too much.
I borrowed a kid's bike, and I got my packages delivered, and that is what you people are going to have to start doing. You have to start doing whatever it takes.
We're also introduced to his relationship with Kelly, which largely relies on juggling his demanding work schedule with her time off. She's a PhD candidate and just as busy as Chuck, as we first see her working late into the night when Chuck returns home from a job. But Kelly appears more capable of compartmentalizing the personal and career aspects of her life. Chuck, on the other hand, brought his work pager to Christmas dinner. Perhaps to drive home the importance of time to Chuck, as well as a theme for this movie, Kelly gives him her father's watch for Christmas. We're also shown that Chuck is made deeply uncomfortable by anything that suggests our time is finite or out of our control.
I've been meaning to ask you, how's Mary?
While on a flight, a colleague offers her sympathy to Chuck's good friend and co-worker, whose wife had been diagnosed with cancer. Chuck appears emotionally distant, almost disturbed, and for once has nothing to say, not even echoing his colleague's condolences. Up until that moment, we as an audience had only known him as confident and capable, a demeanor which later resurfaced as he shifted into problem-solving mode.
I could get his number. The doctor. He could get this thing fixed. You beat it.
It's as though Chuck refused to accept his helplessness in the situation. Chuck's friend dejectedly acknowledged the offer, giving the impression it's not what he wanted or needed to hear.
Thanks, Chuck. So I'll get his number.
There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to offer advice or solutions, but it's not always helpful or appropriate for the situation. In this case, Chuck was more so protecting himself from the discomfort of not having all the answers, rather than helping his friend feel seen and loved. Like I said, Chuck isn't a bad guy. He lives a full life and clearly cares for Kelly and the people in his life. He just didn't have the tools, or perhaps the nerve, to effectively communicate it. His relatability in that regard, and his palpable sincerity, make his words to Kelly before getting on the plane that much more devastating.
I'll be right back!
Chuck had grown comfortable with the predictability of life. He thought if he checked off the right boxes, if he kept the time and the score, he would get to decide. But of course there's that old saying, man plans, God laughs. Broyles is said to be fascinated by failure, by the small and seemingly insignificant things, a mechanical glitch, a stirring in the oxygen tank, that can forever alter your trajectory, that can change the course of your life. And so the plane went down and suddenly Chuck had all the time in the world, and the sin of losing track of time took on a new meaning.
Let's not commit the sin of turning our back on time.
Symbolically, the watch Kelly gave him broke in the crash and the hand stopped turning. 4 years went by, but Chuck never stopped keeping track of time. Only now, for different reasons. Notably, his resourcefulness and ambition, i.e. what got him on that plane on Christmas, are also what rescued him. We even see clues in the beginning of the movie that reveal he's outdoorsy and accomplished in sailing. His planning personality also saved him from what he learned would have been a slow and gruesome suicide. Ultimately, his experience and problem-solving mind are what allowed him to survive and escape the island.
Round that off to 475 feet, a good rope. Now, if we average...
I think this serves to show how our dominating traits can be both our strengths and our weaknesses. The maxim everything in moderation can be applied to our character and personalities, not just our behaviors. This is a more nuanced approach to the character development we're used to seeing, where conflicting character traits must be discarded or overcome entirely for the protagonist to reach their goals. Instead, Chuck continues using this trait to his advantage, but learns to let it go when it's unneeded.
For me, the movie's sort of an illustration of the idea that surviving is easy, but living is difficult.
Time rules over us without mercy, not caring if we're healthy or ill, hungry or drunk, Russian, American, or beings from Mars. It's like a fire. It could either destroy us or keep us warm. These are the first words we hear Chuck say at the start of the film. The thing is, time is vital, just not in the way he originally believed. He too often prioritized a job above all else, at the cost of connections with the people he cared about most. His obsession with time management suddenly became senseless in a place where there was nothing or no one to be responsible for, and all he could do was long for a second chance to use his time differently. In an interview with The Guardian, Hanks was asked if he ever wonders about the road not taken, or the road ahead. He said, "Oh God, you don't think about that. That's not the important stuff. The important stuff is who else is in the car."
The worst thing that happened to Chuck was his plane. He survived a plane crash. If it had just been that, if he had been rescued 2 days later, well, then I think he'd be haunted by that plane crash for the rest of his life. But the fact is, Chuck survived the plane crash, and then he survived the despair of total, solitude and isolation for another 4 years.
I think there's a poignant force for change for Chuck's evolving philosophy early on his time on the island. He discovers the body of one of the pilots in the water and prepares to bury him.
Not Alan, Albert.
He learns that he'd been calling his colleague by the wrong name all this time, and that he had kids who'd never see their father again. This instance subtly illustrates how Chuck was emotionally distant with the people in his life, and how at this point he comes to the realization that he might have lost the chance to connect with them, or anyone, ever again.
So, that's it.
It's well known that humans usually require some level of social interaction to live a healthy life. Prolonged periods of isolation may very likely cause negative effects right down to our brain chemistry. As Aristotle said, man is by nature a social animal. We're genetically inclined to be at least minimally social. And yes, engaging through social media technically counts. In the aforementioned Garden interview, Hanks said, "I think all of the great stories in literature deal with loneliness. Sometimes it's by way of heartbreak, sometimes it's by way of injustice, sometimes it's by way of fate. There's an infinite number of ways to examine it. You can turn everything into an aspect of that battle against quiet despair, because we all fight it at some point in order to feel we're part of humanity." Naturally, to combat his isolation, Chuck did what many of us did as small children and invented an imaginary friend. Wilson is an externalization of Chuck's inner voice, created and repaired by his own blood, and thereby a physical extension of himself as well as psychological. Wilson actually had written lines in the script for Hanks to respond to.
And you said you almost felt like you were going nuts by the end of it, though,
Yeah.
and that also you could actually hear what the volleyball Wilson was saying back to you.
Yeah, when Wilson was born, I had dialogue with him, and I heard his dialogue in my head.
It was not only a practical way to bring about dialogue for this one-man show, but, as Broyle said, here's a man whose emotional connections have not been as deep or as simple and honest as they could have been, and he's learning to communicate and to form this deep attachment not to another human being, but to a volleyball, in a way to his own projection.
You scared? Me too.
Tom Hanks did an incredible job making us feel as though Wilson was real as he bickered and chatted with him. So much so that the iconic scene where Wilson drifts away at sea frequently causes people to break down over the loss of a volleyball.
Wilson!
me, Wilson! Wilson, I'm sorry! I'm sorry!
Oh, Wilson! This was the point when Chuck had to let go of the form of comfort and faux companionship that made it bearable to be stranded alone for so long. With Wilson, Chuck had learned to appreciate humanity once they were no longer around. And when he was forced to choose between saving Wilson or staying with his raft, he made the heart-wrenching choice to let him go just for the remote possibility of returning to civilization. Chuck's obsession with mastering time prevented him from using it considerately. He avoided consoling his friend. He delayed his engagement to Kelly. But in solitude, he recognized his mistakes, gained a new perspective, and he later finally expressed all the things he couldn't before to the people he took for granted.
Dan, I'm so sorry I wasn't around when Mary died. I should have been there for you. And I wasn't. I'm so sorry. I never should have gotten on that plane. I never should have gotten out of the car.
When Chuck returned home, he had to readjust to normal life, but resumed some of his old habits from the island, like sleeping on the floor. He even bought a new volleyball. I feel this somewhat undermines the initial symbolism of letting Wilson go in the first place, but I think he got it because it's a comforting object for him at this point. I'd like to know why y'all think he got it, as I feel it's open to interpretation. Also, if you're incredibly lonely, you can buy your own licensed Wilson volleyball at wilson.com. Anyway, most notably to me, Chuck seemed more withdrawn and gentle, more accepting of the flow of his surroundings. Like at his welcome home party where they had the audacity to serve seafood. He didn't complain. Or when he saw Kelly again the first and the second time. He didn't barge out to meet her even though it had been promised to him. And when she changed her mind about leaving with him, he didn't beg or plead.
I added it up. Knew that I'd lost her.
In that incredible fireside monologue, speaking to his friend who lost his wife and thus could empathize, we watched Chuck simply let things be.
Good luck, cowboy.
Broyles told the LA Times that these two words sum up the film. The idea of acceptance of his fate, that there is no rationale for some of the things that happen to us, but finally there is gratitude.
I'm so sad that I don't have Kelly. But I'm so grateful that she was with me on that island.
As Chuck sits by the fire with ice in his glass and sheds light on his new worldview, he utters a few words I've held close to my heart for years.
You gotta keep breathing. Because tomorrow the sun will rise. Who knows what the tide could bring?
It's not rare for us to feel lost in life, trapped or isolated. We're often plagued with wondering what's next, not knowing where to go from here. Chuck was forced to confront these challenges in the most dramatic of ways. His life had been turned upside down. He had to let go of the person he'd been clinging to for years in isolation and start all over again. Our will to survive, perhaps just for the possibility of connection, is often what keeps us going.
Kelly.
But Chuck hadn't survived just for Kelly. He left one last package unopened, a small goal to accomplish. The image of wings appeared numerous times throughout the film. We see this recurring motif within the first minute of runtime, as a FedEx worker picked up a package from an artist in Texas, which made its way to her cheating husband in Russia, where Chuck was working at the time. The wings became a symbol of hope for Chuck. He drew them on his cave's walls along with pictures of Kelly and Wilson. He painted them on his raft's sail, which served as wings themselves as he triumphantly soared over the tide, escaped the island, and ventured into the unknown. The contents of the package didn't matter, nor did the task's insignificance in the grand scheme of things. The point was he found a reason to hold on. It was perhaps an artificial reason. It didn't genuinely matter whether this person received their package or not, and he could have easily opened it and used its contents the same way he had with the others. But sometimes all you need is a reason, however small and seemingly insignificant. In the last scene of the film, we realize we're back where we began with the now-divorced artist in Texas, surrounded by metal wings, and Chuck stops at a literal crossroads with an important choice to make. It took a long time for Hanks, Broyles, and the director Bob Zemeckis to figure out how they were going to end Chuck's story. Hanks and Broyles spent years tinkering with the script, crafting dozens of drafts and possibilities. How would he be rescued? Would he be reunited with Kelly in the end? Zemeckis wasn't even on board with the film until they decided Chuck would be given a choice to either leave the island or die on it. Chuck described this choice to his friend, revealing his abandoned suicide attempt.
I was going to die there. The only thing I could control was when and how. I made a rope, and I went up to the summit to hang myself. I had to test it, of course. You know me. And the weight of the log snapped the limb of the tree. I couldn't even kill myself the way I wanted to. I had power over nothing.
After this, after another vital choice being stripped away from him, Chuck at last accepted his powerlessness, and in this acceptance, he found peace.
That's when this feeling came over me like a warm blanket.
That isn't to say he stopped making decisions or trying to steer life his way. He did spend weeks, if not months, building a raft and finally escaped the island.
I knew, somehow, that I had to stay alive.
Dr. Catherine Bergstrom, a humanities professor, wrote an article for the Journal of Religion and Film comparing Castaway to Robinson Crusoe. In it, she notes, the mainstream discourse of hope, the one that provides ontological meaning and a cosmic connection, also allows for the narration of a free, coherent self in what many see as an incoherent world. The paired beliefs in design and a free will may be a paradox, but the hope of meaning is as strong as ever among the postmodern masses. Interestingly, it was after Chuck accepted his fate that the porta-potty sail washed ashore.
Even though there was no reason to hope, and all my logic said that I would never see this place again, I kept breathing. And then one day that logic was proven all wrong because the tide came in, gave me a sail.
And after Wilson floated away and Chuck let go of his paddles, effectively giving up his power, it was only then he drifted into view of a cargo ship and was rescued. I think this is a portrayal of our free will as it collides and coalesces with the whims of the universe, depicting our powerlessness and insignificance, but in a way that's ultimately comforting. Our choices and our logic become merely incidental when paired with the randomness of the world we live in. In this framework, life becomes a simple series of choices given and choices taken away. We don't get to impose our order onto the world, no matter how much we try to force it. And for me, it's a reminder not to take life too seriously and to arrange my priorities in proportion to their actual worth. I'm glad they chose the ending they did. I feel it's more memorable and meaningful. I don't think Castaway would have meant as much to me if after their kiss in the rain, Kelly had stayed in the car and they drove off to start their lives together, brushing aside consequences. It's far more reassuring to see Chuck face reality and choose to work with the cards he was dealt, to keep breathing, to stand at the crossroads with no assurances about what lies ahead, still knowing it's going to be okay. Delivering the package meant closing this chapter of his life and moving on to a new one.
You look lost.
I do?
Where are you headed?
Well, I was just about to figure that out.
Dr. Bergstrom expanded on Chuck's new perspective. Resigning himself to the mysteries of an unknown design, he says, "Tomorrow the sun will rise. Who knows what the tide will bring? There will be new signs, new choices. In other words, more life. The time we live and die by is no longer linear time signified by a man-made clock. Signs of time are provided by cosmic forces that represent a timeless eternity, the sun rising and setting, the tide ebbing and flowing." Based on the direction Chuck's looking in the final shot, we can surmise he chose the unpaved road, i.e. the road less traveled, back to the artist's house. He had lost Kelly, but he still maintained the capacity for love and for life. This is why I think the film had a happy ending, or at least one that left me with a sense of solace and hope. The ebb and flow of our lives isn't predictable or always favorable. Sometimes the waves can be unforgiving, the current too overwhelming. But if we keep breathing, the tide may bring a sail. Thanks so much for watching and for 50k subs. Let me know how you felt about Castaway's ending or if you think they should have done things differently. I'd also love to know what your comfort movies are or what you've been watching this past year to get you feeling inspired. Thanks again, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye!